Hello friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And I'm here today to talk about small space homesteading. Now I've been doing videos like this for a while where I talk about small space gardening, container gardening and so on, but I wanted to expand this out to include homesteading in general. And so I'm going to be touching on a lot of the same things that I've talked about in previous videos over the years to refresh you all and to kind of give you an idea what we do. All the photos you'll be seeing included in this video, all from our various different garden areas through the years. So going back at least 10 years, because our different garden areas have changed a lot, we've expanded, and always trying to find ways to make things better and make the most of our space. But anyway, I'm also going to talk about how we make it work with the chickens. And those are the only other animals we have here on the homestead. But people trying to do homesteading in small spaces can also include things like rabbits and quail because they're quiet and take up very little space. Before I get into my list I made here, I do want to explain for those of you who are new, what we have here is we've been doing everything, pretty much everything here on this little shy 1/3 acre corner lot in a neighborhood in town. We do, since I've started my channel, we have acquired a couple more pieces of property. We have a shy acre piece just down the road, and then we have another 6-acre piece outside of town. And little by little, we're going to be expanding onto those, but still, regardless, this is where we live, so we try to do as much as we can right here because it's going to be so much easier for us to maintain, to harvest from, take care of our chickens, and more. I just wanted to throw that out there so you kind of understand where we're at and, why we're, even though we have this other property we can expand out on, why we're still doing all this here and still trying to find ways to better what we have right here. Obviously, the first thing when it comes to gardening is finding ways to grow upwards. So going as vertical as possible, you're going to make the most of your space. Now, one way you can do that with some things is with the green stalk. I do have one green stalk and I do like it. I use it solely for strawberries, but some people use it for many other things. I think it would be a great one to use for growing herbs, and you could have all kinds of different herbs in there. And I always have a link to the green stalk down in my description box. But there's other things that you can do, especially if you can't afford to buy a setup like that, then you can piece together something of your own. For example, one that I've mentioned a lot was back when our oldest son and daughter-in-law got married, Patrick had made a pie tree for them because they didn't have cake, they had pie. And so he made this little tree, as you can see in this picture, and then the pies were laid out. Some of the pies were laid out on the tree and the rest on the table down below that. But after the wedding was over, they didn't need it anymore, so they just gave it back to us. And so I'm like, cool. I can use this to put pots on and grow more stuff. And so I actually have that sitting on my front deck with a bunch of small pots with strawberries. I grow strawberries only in containers here. I find they're safer from slugs if I do that rather than putting them directly in the ground. So I have strawberries in there. I have strawberries in the green stalk, and I have strawberry plants on the little shelves that Patrick made to go inside my juniper bush that we keep pruning back to keep it opened up to get plenty of air, rain, and sunlight. That's just an example of ways that you can make the most of your different spaces, be they deck spaces and more. Another thing that I do is that I had Patrick do for me years ago was on the south side of my greenhouse wall on the outside, he put some shelves, and then we bought a bunch of the long, narrow pots, and then I would grow all kinds of different things in there. I first started out growing strawberries just in those, but then eventually, especially when my grapevines grew up around our deck and shaded that area too much, I can't grow as many things in the pot, but lettuce does well in those. So I grow a lot of lettuces in those. Any wall that you don't mind putting some shelves on, lettuce can do well without a whole lot of sun. But if you're looking at growing things that like a lot of light, look for walls that are exterior walls that are south facing, and put yourself some shelves on there. You can use the long, narrow pots or do deeper shelves and then have more round pots sitting around if you want. Another thing I had Patrick do was a few years ago now, he built me a set of shelves that we can move around that sit on the back deck It's in a more shady area, but I do have pots there where I grow mostly now. What I'm growing there in there is all violets, because I find my violets, the leaves and everything just do better and get bigger when they don't get a lot of direct sun. Where they get more shade, the leaves will get much bigger, because you can harvest the leaves and the flowers of violets, and they're, you know, just like pansies, they have a lot of uses. And then there's also companion planting. And I'm not one to specifically look at what plants grow best beside each other. I'm looking at what's going to grow best in this particular area according to the amount of sun it gets, the amount of rain it gets, the amount of just any kind of exposure to heat or cold that it gets, and just cram things together. I'll try things out. Some things need more space than others, but some things, like a lot of your herbs, you can pack your herbs in there and a lot of your herbs will do really good. Like here's an example from a couple years ago, my West herb garden. It looks pretty much the same every year. So I haven't shot a new video in a while, but I've just got a whole bunch of herbs growing side by side right in there. And sometimes I have to go in there and move things around, switch things up, put something different in, or weed some things out, like the feverfew that tends to just want to, you know, keeps reseeding itself and making new plants. Just pull those up and then put something different in there, or let something else fill in. A lot of your mints will grow well amongst other herbs without crowding them out. And it's just a matter of keeping up on them to prevent that from happening. So you can make the most of your different spaces that way. And then also there's, like with my front garden area, I have this section that I use for potatoes. Well, potatoes are something you typically put in the ground early, like end of March or in April. And then 3 months later, they're ready to dig up. Though you can leave potatoes in the ground until you need them, I find it best to dig the potatoes up and then put something that does better later in the season, such as amaranth. And so plant that amaranth in there and then let that grow, and then I can use the amaranth. And then the amaranth is also helping to feed nutrients back into the soil. And these are just a couple of examples. So think of your areas where you can plant one thing that will grow quickly and then harvest. Radish is another. And then you can turn around and plant something else right after that that does better later in the season. So where radishes can bolt if it gets too hot, so they're better earlier in the season, then you can replace that with something else, like maybe carrots. But especially look at things that can also help replenish the nutrients in the soil. But you can also do that by growing, like I grow comfrey and nettle, and these are a couple of things that are good at replenishing the soil. So even though I dehydrate up a lot of nettle and a lot of comfrey, and they spread quite a bit too, you can make like a compost tea out of them. Some people do that. I don't do it that way. I just do it the more natural way, which is going to end simple. And that's going to be chop and drop. Just chop that stuff down, because it'll keep growing back. It'll keep growing back. And then just throw it down on the garden and let it do its thing. Just don't, like, especially with the nettle, if it's already seeded, don't do that, because you're going to have nettle coming up all over if you do that. So this year, my plan is to not even let my nettle go to seed. I'm just going to, once I'm done dehydrating up what I want, then after that, I'm just going to keep chopping it down before it tries to seed, and then just keep throwing it on the garden out there. It just whatever's close, and let it keep putting nutrients back in the soil that way. And even dandelion greens, if you're growing dandelions intentionally in places like I do, so you can harvest the greens and the flowers, but maybe they're getting too big, or you're getting a lot more than you need, you can do the same thing. You can just chop them down, throw those leaves on there. There's lots of minerals in those leaves that can go back into the soil. And also the other benefit I found by doing that is if you have a lot of slugs will get drawn to the things that you've already chopped and dropped, and then be more likely to leave the things that you're still trying to allow grow alone. I found this by accident, and it was pretty cool. So now you're going to wonder, well, how does this play into chickens, dogs, and so on? So let's get to that. One of the other things I've done, and it was several years ago, we had bought a whole bunch of hanging pots. That was my way to try to make the most of our space, was have a lot of hanging pots, and then experimented through the years, what can I put in my hanging pots that's going to do best? I tried pansies and beans, rosemary, because I know rosemary likes well-drained soil, so I figured they would like that. I've done strawberries, and they always just did so-so. And then what happened, just like I mentioned, is like around the back deck where we had a lot of them planted, is my grapevines kept getting bigger and fuller every year. And so now I can't hang anything in that area anymore because it just gets too crowded over with the grapevines. And so nothing gets any sunlight. And so I was having that to contend with too. And I was just simply running out of areas to put these pots because of that. And since nothing really did great for me, things as far as things that I wanted to grow so that we could consume them, nothing was really doing great. So I took those hanging pots and repurposed all of them, every single one of them. And so again, you're probably wondering, how's this playing to the chickens? Well, one of the things that I do, and I used to do this out front, I don't do that so much now. I just fence the chickens off from the potato area once I got them in the ground. But I'm still doing this in the back, is if I want to still let the chickens roam around certain areas to get as many bugs and slugs and goodies that they can around in the garden area and keep laying down their own fertilizer and keeping things tilled up, because I don't want to block them from that area entirely, then what I do is I take the pots, I invert them over the things I've just planted. This can be the potatoes, or it can be any kind of perennial herb that I want to keep safe in an area where the chickens are still allowed to roam, but I want to give it time to establish itself first so that it's really well in the ground and I know the chicken's big feet aren't going to dig it up. Then I'll invert those pots over that and then put a stick through it to hold it in place, because the chickens can move those hanging pots. They don't very often, but they can move them off of those things with their feet. So putting a stick in there to secure them in the ground is a good idea. And another idea, if you don't have hanging pots or you don't want to go buy hanging pots just for this purpose, is look for some cheap wire mesh trash cans. And this will also keep your cats and your dogs away from those things as well. If you're just trying to, protect certain things, anything where they can still get water and sunlight and plenty of air is going to work good for that. And that way you can still give your animals places to roam without having to completely block them off from areas. Now, my chickens, despite everything, even in the midsummer, they still have plenty of areas to roam. It's just that in the summer, when a lot of the things are growing, they don't have as much as they do through the winter. So the things get blocked off a little bit at a time. And then how I do that is, I did a video last year just on these because I'm always finding more uses for them, but I use those dog yards. It's like a little fence that you can put in the shape of a square, rectangle, or, just a kind of a roundish shape. I don't remember how many sides. I think there's 8, so it'd be an octagon. I use those a lot, and you can get them in different heights. You can get them in the 4 foot, you can get them in 2 foot, anything that you need to keep smaller animals out, or even if it's bigger animals. Most of the time the chickens won't go over the 2 foot one. I can do pretty good with that, but in some places they will. So it just depends on where I'm putting them. But anyway, I'm going to link down below to the video I did last year on the many uses for these dog pens, because you can stretch them out long, you can make them in any shape you want, and they work great. So once I'm ready to totally block off the chickens from certain areas, I can use those. I also use the taller movable fencing. That's what we have out here in the front. We have it permanently around that main garden section, and the chickens are allowed to roam in there through a good part of the year. But then when I put the potatoes in the ground, then there's another part of that fence that I do move, and then I stretch that across so the chickens, they come through the fence and they can have this narrow area where the stinging nettle is, where they can still hang out in there in the early morning is when they like that best. But they can't get in here and dig up my potatoes because I don't have that many hanging pots anymore to cover all those potatoes up out there and in the back as well. Then the other thing I do is I repurpose, coming back to garden related stuff, the chains that hold the hanging pots. I've repurposed every single one of those chains. And usually you've got 3, and mine all had hooks on them where I could unhook it from the pot and then hook them together. So I've got places where I've got the chains hanging in long pieces, and I plant beans at the base of those. You can do this with peas as well, and the beans will climb up the chain. And then also on the deck, I have the beans that climb up the chain, but then I also have the chain strung across the deck this way, and the beans will keep climbing across that way. So it makes it look really pretty, but it also gives me more places where I can go grow beans by utilizing those chains for those kind of things. And I can do that, like I said, right on the deck is one of the places I grow beans, and then use those chains for them to grow on. And then one more thing I wanted to bring up, well, we're talking about homesteading. This usually involves things like canning and wanting to do cooking outside as well. We get rain all year round. In the summer, we tend to get some dry weather, and all we have really, the only good area for this is the back deck. I rarely ever do canning inside the house. I do all my canning on a propane burner that originally came with a turkey fryer that we probably only did 2 turkeys at most in that thing, but ever since it's been used for canning. That's water bath canning and pressure canning, and I do that all out on the deck. So I try to get all of my canning done during that time of the year. I haven't done it in a few years, but a lot of times in the summertime, I'd pull out our rocket stove, and we'd have this little rocket stove setup that would be like a temporary thing we could take down for the winter. And I would do a lot of cooking on the rocket stove in the summer. Cooking outside during any other time of the year is pointless because of the great amount of rain we get. Now, most of the time, what I do in the summer is I rely on solar power, whether it be cooking inside the house on something that is plugged into our solar power or using our solar oven. But all that stuff has to happen on the deck. But if you don't have solar power and you're trying to find ways to save electricity and make the most and be a little more off grid, then, you know, a rocket stove is a really good idea, as well as a solar oven. Solar oven's more for baking, where a rocket stove you can use for, you know, when you're doing stovetop type cooking, and you can put anything in that rocket stove pretty much, as long as it's small enough to get in the fire area. You can use like scrap, like let's say, you know, the marshmallow stalks get really big, and by spring they're all dried out. I can break those off. That makes good fire material right there. Pine cones or any other kind of tree cones. There's a lot of things you can burn in a rocket stove. You just have to keep feeding it all the time. But I did a bunch of videos years ago of cooking on a rocket stove. So if I have those in a playlist, I'll link to them down below, or at least link it to one of them so you can see, you know, how I use the rocket stove for cooking. You know, and also keep in mind, there's other things that we have going on around here. We've got a chicken coop. We've got a 1,200 square foot shop out here. And we've got the house, which is about 2,400 square feet because it's a rambler. We don't have a 2-story house. And then we also have heavy equipment. So a lot of it will stay down at the other piece of property, which is one of the nice things about having that, because we have all this heavy equipment. But we also have areas here where we can park the heavy equipment. And then we have literally like a little parking lot. So even on this little shy 1/3 acre piece, we can have a dump truck, an excavator, and then a parking lot full of rigs, and all the gardening that we're doing here, and the chickens and the dogs and the shop. And and our firewood storage too. A lot of that, pretty much all that is right here on this little area. And I did a video a couple years ago where I kind of mapped it out so people could get an idea how we kind of squeeze all this in. Some things have changed, you know, certain garden areas have been added since, so it's not quite the same as it was, but I'll go ahead and link back to that video. It will give you an idea. And we've also expanded areas of the garden since too, especially out here, out front, because that's where we've been able to expand the most now, because pretty much the backyard is pretty much filled up. So anyway, there's a few ideas, and any other suggestions, ideas anyone want to throw out there for making all this work in a small area, please put those in comments down below so people can learn from you as well. And thanks for watching. Take care, and God bless.